Good afternoon, Hartford, and welcome again to our show, Voices of Veterans, which is put on by a couple of veterans, myself, Dave Yano, a Vietnam veteran, and Steve Fournier, an Air Force veteran, Vietnam era, and one of our colleagues, Jim Brazel, is here today. He's a former Marine and a Vietnam veteran, to watching the filming of the show. And we just want to reiterate how happy we are that Hartford Public Access Television, cable access television, has provided Hartford residents with the opportunity to put on programming that they choose to put on, and developing the ideas that they feel are important and that are worth value to the people of Hartford. And that's part of what we're here to do today. So one of the things that we do with the show is as Voices of Veterans, I have had veteran guests on, fellow veterans who've had time to share their experiences with us on the show, and also to share their experiences with the audience. And then the other part of Voices for Veterans is the fact that as a former librarian who works in the city of Hartford for the Hartford Public Library, I have invested a lot of time studying and finding and accessing books written by combat veterans, not only of Vietnam, but of all the wars that the United States has been involved in. Veterans from the First World War, veterans from the Second World War books, and also veterans from our most recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So when I do these readings, this is the voice of a veteran that you're hearing, and I'm just providing the venue so that voice can be heard. And one of the books that I've been using recently, and one that I find to be most in line with how I feel about war and the military, is this book called Packing Inferno: The Unmaking of a Marine by Tyler E. Boudreau. Tyler Boudreau lives up in Massachusetts, and he spent 17 years in the Corps, first as an enlisted, then he became an officer. And he went to Iraq in 2004, 2005, when the war was at its hottest. And so he wrote this book. And it portrays in very clear terms the psychological and spiritual predicament that veterans are in when they go off to war. Because when we're training in the military, we're conditioned. And a lot of our conditioning is based on what they feel is a way to dehumanize the enemy, to make them seem less than human so that it's easier for us to kill them. And that's what Tyler Boudreau is talking about in this particular chapter. It's called Hate. One day in Iraq at a commander's meeting, word got up to the colonel that an Iraqi detainee fell off the back of a 7-ton truck with a hood over his head and his hands flex-cuffed behind his back. That's one hell of a fall. Everybody in the room laughed, and these were officers. I laughed. The colonel laughed. But he straightened himself up a bit and said with half a smile, "Let's not have that happen again." We all laughed again. "No, seriously," he said, in a not-so-serious tone. This was a treacherous territory for him, because he surely knew that detainees falling off trucks wasn't a good thing. But then losing the esteem of his officers for being too soft-hearted wouldn't be a good thing either. Nor would losing his own killer instinct, and both might just have come in jeopardy if he sympathized with the enemy too much. A detainee getting shoved off the back of a truck was just the beginning. The deployment was still young. The hatred had only begun to germinate. There's always a lot of talk about developing hatred when it comes to war. You got to hate them before you can kill them. That sort of thing. So whenever a war comes along, little anecdotes crop up about how we hate it. We called them Krauts, or Japs, or Slopes, or Dinks, or Gooks, or Camel Jockeys, or Hajis. We called them them. We broke them from humanity, and then we broke ourselves from humanity too. And we met them out there in no man's land, and we killed them. That's how we hated. But there was a catch this time, a flaw in the program. This wasn't supposed to be a real war. This was supposed to be a liberation. And we weren't supposed to hate the Iraqis. We were supposed to respect them, to befriend them, and to make them want to befriend us. The officers in particular were cautioned never to fall into the habit of using racial epithets. Stay mindful of your professionalism, they said. Not every officer followed this advice, but most did. I tried, though I wasn't always successful. I did my fair share of hating too, but I tried to remember the mission they claimed we'd gone out to do. Win their hearts and minds, they told us. Win the support of the people, and the insurgency will fall. The Iraqi people are friends to the American people. This was the pitch, and I bought it. The concept of winning hearts and minds seems ludicrous to me now. I don't know how I missed it. What would we do without hate? How would we fight? How would we kill? Hatred for Muslims in America didn't start in 9/11, but it sure got a whole lot more fashionable that day. For the attack against the United States, no, for the insult, for the audacity, I wanted blood. I just didn't know whose yet, but I was pretty sure they were going to turn out to be Muslim. So I understand the anger. I understand the life-clenching rage at the people who attacked us on 9/11. I get it. I felt it. A lot of people did. And that rage was the fuel that sent us a rationale for war. But then I guess it didn't really have to be. The images were all there in the background of our collective consciousness. The crumbling towers, the great balls of fire, the people leaping hand in hand from flaming windows to their deaths. It was all so terrible and close to home that the only appropriate emotion that I can imagine was hatred. Suddenly there was a fear of a new kind of warfare, asymmetrical warfare, jihadism, the kind of warfare where a single desperate man can haul a nuclear warhead in his knapsack into downtown Boston and light it off like a Roman candle, or slip a jar under the seat in the subway of some pestilent virus that will spread geometrically across the city before even the first victim is found foaming at the mouth in the ER, his flesh necrotizing from the inside out. That's what they call WMD, weapons of mass destruction. Soon, every Muslim became a suspect. Every family with an Arab-sounding name became a terrorist sleeper cell, just waiting for their orders to attack the infidels, waiting for their opportunity to martyr themselves for Allah. I've met a whole lot of people who never felt a bit of what I'm talking about, but then again, I met a whole lot of people who did. Our hatred was palpable. By the time we got to the war, it was ingrained. The trouble with preemptive hate on the battlefield is that it tends to hinder a soldier's ability to make clear-headed analysis of his circumstances and react prudently. Decisions are always impassioned, rash, hateful. The hate blinds him. But conversely, for a soldier to enter the battlefield without that preemptive hate would be to hamper his ability to kill quickly and therefore survive. And so the hate stands. When we got to Iraq, we weren't just calling the bad Iraqis Hajis, that is, the Iraqis who were shooting at us. We were calling all of them Hajis, because insurgents live within the populace, and the bad guys could have been anybody. We had to be prepared to kill everybody, and that meant we had to hate everybody. It's tough to win the hearts and minds of people you hate. In Homage to Catalonia, George Orwell gives an interesting account of a street fight in Barcelona that broke out between the communists and the Trotskyists, who were other communists. Up until that moment, they'd been on the same team, fighting on the same side of the Spanish Civil War. Suddenly, every block became a battlefield, every building a barricade. But the soldiers, whether on one side of the street or the other, were not inherently hostile towards each other. They were all workers. They were countrymen. They were neighbors. They passed food and water across the lines to each other. They joked from the building tops. They didn't shoot at each other. It was the basis for peace if ever there could have been. But then orders arrived from on high. Orders to hate. Orders to open fire. Orders to kill. And that's just what they did. The experience must have made an impression on Orwell. In 1984, he imagines a people of the future who gather daily for the 2-minute hate. A mandatory rage aimed at whoever is deemed the current enemy in a war that seems never to end. Throughout the story, the enemy alternates inexplicably, and whoever is not the enemy is praised as an ally. No one seems to notice the capriciousness of it all. They're all too busy hating. This caricature of reality is not so drastic, I think. We are, after all, in an endless war ourselves, the war on terror, and the enemy is always changing. In my time in Iraq, the Sunnis were the enemy. We hated them. We hated them for their connection with Saddam Hussein. We hated them because we were told to hate them. And we loved the Shia. Years later, I discovered things had changed. Suddenly, I was reading articles about our efforts to work with the Sunni, the good Sunnis, and to rid their towns of the evil Shia militias. I picked up a magazine which contained a story titled An Unlikely Ally about the Sunni. The Shia became the enemy, the current enemy, and the designated recipients of our hate. Orwell's notion of the 2-minute hate was not so far-fetched after all. He goes on to another chapter talking about manufacturing killers. I think it's fair to say that the taking of human life is something we as a species are inherently reluctant to do. I've read that in books, but I felt in my gut too. But the soldiers kill for a living. It is his reason for being. Killing is not a byproduct or some shitty collateral duty like peeling potatoes or scrubbing the latrine. It is the institutional point. It's our it's not a trade secret, it just is. So how does the soldier bridge the gap between nature and his job? It's a process known as desensitization. Every soldier is desensitized. I was too. War is the graduation exercise. As a training company officer in the recruit depot, I participated in the transformation of high school boys into desensitized killers. As an infantry officer, I trained them to work together as a unit, to kill as a team. Back at boot camp, they had me spouting off the mission of the Marine Corps Rifle Squad, to locate, to close with, and destroy the enemy by fire and maneuver, and to repel the enemy's assault by fire and close combat. They taught us martial arts, the axe kick, a swift driving heel into the enemy's face as he lay immobilized on the ground. They promised if we did it right, we'd leave his skull a broken mess. They taught us how to sneak up behind the enemy and dig a combat knife up under his rib cage, how to gouge out his eyeballs, how to cut off the supply of blood to his head or the air to his lungs, and how to rip out his testicles. We learned how to butt stroke him in the face, to thrust our bayonets into his flesh, and we practiced on hanging dummies. They weren't the inanimate tire sacks of the old days. These dummies were dressed in uniforms, and they were heavy and dense like a man, and we screamed, "Kill!" as our blades punctured their skins. Most of all, we learned to look upon the act of killing with nonchalance. It was all just a game, a sport. It was fun, and we went home and bragged to our friends about all the new ways we'd learned to take another man's life. Our friends were impressed, and they said shit like, "That's badass, man." I watched the documentary Sir, No Sir by David Ziegler about the veterans' anti-war movement during the Vietnam. There was a former Marine talking about a survival class on the killing and disemboweling of rabbits. He described how they led the rabbit out on a leash and slapped it on his head until it was dead. Then they gutted it out, pointed out the crowd and said, "Someday you might have to do this to stay alive." He felt the lesson was more about desensitization than survival, getting them used to killing. His testimony made an impression on me because 30 years later I got that same class. They were still teaching the same lessons. They taught us to suck the eyeballs out of the rabbit's skull for water. Then the instructor put the rabbit skin on his hand like a puppet, pressing his fingers up into its brain, and gave his own little puppet show. We got a good laugh. We took pictures. I still have mine. It was indeed a class about survival of both body and mind. All this psychological conditioning is what the Army and the military is very good at, because they realize that men looking another man in the eye, or even a child or a baby, would hesitate. And you can't hesitate when you want to kill something. That's the way that... And thoughts like this beget heresy. Heresy begets retribution. I do not fear retribution because I have steeled my soul with the armor of contempt. On the day that the World Trade Towers fell, I was en route to the Newington VA for an Agent Orange appointment. I arrived in the midst of controlled paranoia and fear. I left before my appointment as the ghosts of Vietnam were everywhere. My brothers in arms and I spoke bitterly later on what had happened. We said very heretical things to one another. I said, "Welcome to the war, America. How does it feel?" And Joe said they should have flown the planes into Wall Street. We knew, unlike the rest of our countrymen, what it feels like to kill women and children. We had mounted a war machine that indiscriminately searched out and destroyed human life all over the planet. Did we think we would be safe forever back here in the world? I have utter contempt for the chicken hawk rear echelon motherfuckers in the White House. They have betrayed and abused the men and women of the United States Armed Forces. And when they come home, they will bring the war with them, and they will give it to us. Cowardly Senator Lieberman and the arrogant Senator McCain are wrong. Al-Qaeda and the phantom terrorists will never invade and occupy America. They are already here, present in the Patriot Act, in Guantanamo, and in the White House. I have utter contempt for men who know nothing about the people of Iraq or Afghanistan and yet seek to ram democracy and Western thought down their collective throats. T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, fought with the Arabs against the Turks and wrote in the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, "The effort for these years to live in the dress of Arabs and to imitate their mental foundation quitted me of my English self and let me look at the West and its conventions with new eyes. They destroyed it all for me. Easily was a man made an infidel, but hardly might he be converted to another faith. I had dropped one form and not taken on the other, and was become like Muhammad's coffin in our legend, with resultant feeling of intense loneliness in life and a contempt, not for other men, but for all that they do." Vietnam veterans understand what he is saying. Some of us fell in love with the Vietnamese and their country and drove ourselves to madness looking through the veil of two cultures, two environments at once. The utter lack of respect and knowledge that Americans have of other cultures and peoples is very visible in the rest of the world. Our soldiers are carrying out missions depending on people whose language they don't know and whose culture they don't understand. To the Iraqis, we have assumed the aspect of the British and Turkish rulers of the past century. Ask the Soviet Afghansi, the Russian veterans of their Vietnam and Afghanistan, and they will tell you they are ashamed of what happened. They are on the same ghost road as I am. We will live with the war for the rest of our days, and we will not forget. But more importantly, we won't let the nation or the world forget. I wrote that as one of the pieces I was writing when I was submitting articles to the Underground Current, as it was called, the Undercurrent at the time, which was an underground newspaper. As a matter of fact, I think one of the things that Americans need today is more of that underground culture that used to be out there in the 60s and the 70s. Tyler Boudreau in his book mentioned the documentary Sir and Oh Sir. If you get a chance, you should check it out because it's a good documentary on the resistance movement within the military by the GIs themselves. And it's what led to the Winter Soldier investigations when the combat veterans of Vietnam came home and revealed exactly what they'd been doing in the field when they were interrogating suspected VC, So all of this information is out there. And one of the reasons why we're doing this show is to make people aware that veterans themselves are the ones who are the most important voice about what's happening in the military machine and in the wars that we're waging all over this planet. So we have to be aware of that, and we have to listen to the veterans. It was the veterans themselves who brought an end to the Vietnam War. When the Winter Soldiers investigations came out and Vietnam Veterans Against the War was formed, close to 50,000 GIs at one time were members of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. So that's just one way that the voices of veterans can have an impact on the United States today. And I think it's in light of what's happening today, and in light of what we have and who we have in the White House right now, it's more important than ever that the voices of veterans are listened to and heard. Hopefully these programs, which we hope will be soon, will be accessed on YouTube. We'll be able to see them. And that's what we hope to have more guests of the show, and we hope to have more voices of veterans so that you can listen to us and hear what we have to say about our experience in the military, which I feel is very vital to the survival of the nation, that we not abuse and misuse our warriors and our soldiers who put their lives on the line for the rest of us. I think it's so important that the Constitution is what we fought for, is what's recognized as the most vital part of American society today. And it's when you take that oath, you're not swearing allegiance to the commander-in-chief. It's not a loyalty oath to a particular person. It's an oath to the Constitution. And that means it's an oath to the American people. And that's the most important thing that can be said. Tyler Boudreau's book, I think, is something that is necessary for us to take a hard look at. One of the other chapters he's written here is called War Crimes. April of 2004 was a big month in Iraq. The first siege on Fallujah began. Unfortunately, by the time my battalion pulled into town and was ready to fight, the brass had already agreed to hold off an attack for further negotiations. This disappointed us. We didn't want to talk. We wanted to brawl. Instead, they sent us to a small town called Karma, midway between Fallujah and Baghdad. We called it Bad Karma because it sounded ominous, I suppose, and because it was said to be the spot where Fallujah's insurgents were getting resupplied. The bosses brought us in, and they told us, the last company to go in there met some pretty heavy resistance. We want you guys to go in there and clear them out. We saluted and said, no problem. The heavier the better. But when we arrived into Karma, everybody was already gone. The place was a ghost town. We still managed to find a few Iraqis lurking in the shadows to detain and shove behind bars. We always managed to do that, and we found a few stashes of weapons and ammunition. But other than that, the days in Karma were dull. That was the same month that the Abu Ghraib scandal broke. Abu Ghraib was a tough-looking spot and drab. We used to drive past it all the time, and when we did, I could almost feel the evil heaving from the pores of the stony walls. Well, that's the way it seemed to me at the time. The first I'd heard about Abu Ghraib was back home on TV before I went to war. It was a documentary about Saddam's torture central. This was the place where he sent political dissidents. They had some grim stories to tell about the kind of business that went on there. Some pretty horrifying stories. And if all those stories would swirl around the walls and blow in our faces as we passed it by, and had one hell of an aura. They said thousands upon thousands of Iraqis were executed there and thrown into mass graves. That's a lot of dissonance. But all that was under Saddam Hussein, the butcher of Baghdad. And he was long gone, out of action. By the time we got into town, it was already a U.S. facility. It was still a creepy place to look at, but one felt inclined to believe the worst was in its past. And I suppose it was relatively, but then we got to look at those pictures for the first time, and we heard all the news stories of torture. So it turned out Abu Ghraib was still a house of horrors. But these weren't Iraqis doing the torturing. These were Americans. That made a difference, and it made for a lot of hard reflection. I knew more than a few guys whose whole attitude toward the war changed the moment they saw those photographs. Of course, not everybody was appalled. I'd say the most prevalent take to that officer's circles was that it was unprofessional. A bunch of dumbass kids who got hold of a little of authority for the first time in their lives, and I'd say that's just about where I stood. We're over?
Yeah,
Okay.
I missed the,
The call?
I missed the call, yeah.
All right.
I couldn't hear her. I was, we were,
I was thinking it was almost there. I saw somebody stick their head in to watch.
you saw somebody do what?
Somebody else came in there to take a look at what we were doing?
Yeah, but that was, yeah, he's got a show,
Oh, cool.
and he was interested in your show, and,
Our show.
yeah.
Did you stop the recording or what?
It stops on.
Yeah, she
oh,
stopped
yeah,
at
it
2:30,
stopped.
so we were, she didn't give us the high sign, otherwise I would have ended on a, Steve usually gives me
She
the,
didn't say
Well,
anything.
Steve usually says, okay, that's it, and then we.
yeah, she,
I don't
I'm
think
sure
wrap
that
it
she,
up.
I'm sure she did, but she's not loud, as loud as Mike, and so I
I was
didn't hear her.
listening, I didn't hear anything, but maybe I missed it too. But this fella.
Yeah, and we were trying to figure out how to do the